So we are here at chapter 16. As you can see, we are here at Fort Nelson, which features obviously in this chapter. This chapter is going to be read to you by Miss Fowles, who is a maths teacher.
16. A mighty ship of glory be. Camp Browndown seemed to stand calm amid the bombing. An eerie place that had consumed death and revelled in evil. It simply didn't matter that on the other side of the harbour, Gizzle's homeland was being attacked. Their mission continued just the same. Orders were orders, and theirs were to exterminate an entire race and rid the empire of the red vermin squirrel and its sympathisers. The furnaces raged and grew hotter with red tinder. The chimneys bellowed great plumes of smoke out into the midday sun. The campmates were never more depleted. Only a few hundred scattered around each barrack remained, attempting to look indispensable in order to be spared the fate of their fellows. The air was black and white, and the ground covered in thick, snowy ash, while others fruitlessly hid. Doris stood at the doorway of the barracks waiting. An officer who was gathering the remaining prisoners at gunpoint onto the parade ground scurried over to Doris, grabbed her by the arm and marched her quickly onto the square. She didn't resist. The officer, a young grey squirrel with a thin face and a haunted expression, looked slightly unnerved, as they all did. The prisoners were lined up in single file and marched the long walk towards the gas chambers at the edge of the camp. As they marched, Doris observed Colonel Fratton standing in full Gizzle military uniform outside the chamber, his arms crossed behind his back, observing the spectacle with pride and madness. The officers began hastening the line of prisoners, shouting and whipping them, pushing and shoving them. There appeared suddenly now some urgency to their deaths. Just as quickly as she had observed the camp leader, Colonel Fratton, Doris heard an almighty clash of metal versus motor. The line of prisoners fell to the ground as Gizzle guards began running in all directions. Some attempted to preserve some order, but not very successfully. The prisoners scattered quickly around the camp in all directions. Shots were being fired, and Gizzle guards were falling to the ground. Colonel Fratton remained arrogantly still at the entrance to the gas chamber. The Allied army from Winchester, led by General Henry Palmerston, had crashed through the gates of Camp Browndown. Any resistance from the Gizzle army was met immediately with death, and those who looked timid were quickly captured as prisoners of war. Doris, who stood in the middle of the parade square, shots being fired around her, watched on as Allied officer of the WWF approached Colonel Fratton, shackling his feet and binding his arms. He arrogantly and symbolically saluted with a "Hail Gizzle" gesture, twitching his tail in defence. Henry Palmerston surveyed the liberation and spotted Doris standing alone, still on the parade square, numb and exhausted. He walked calmly over to her. She did not look at him and was staring blankly at the gas chambers in the distance. "What's happened here?" asked Henry, who saw how weak and thin Doris was. She turned her head slightly, breaking out of her trance to look at him. "Fate," she said, echoing the words of her wise old friend, the late Peter Mumby. His ego still shaken from the punch to his face, Gizzle was ushered by his men through the tunnels of Fort Nelson. "My lord, we must retreat further," said his aide, a portly weasel, ushering him down some crooked steps deeper underground and into the secret passage-ways hidden in the chalky hills themselves. "My treasures?" he asked as he submitted to being pulled along by his men to safety. "They will follow, my lord," said his aide, trying to hurry him along. Still hidden from view, Captain Willie's fishing boat, laden with passengers, continued to bump against the wall of the dock. Shots continued to be fired and bombs continued to rage. Gizzle troops were still hunting the white rabbit and his companions, known to be a red squirrel and a mole. "We could row it," suggested Berry, looking across the small fishing inlet out towards Gosport. "Don't be silly, Berry," said Hertha. "We'd never make it. They've got the harbour patrolled, and besides, if we cast away here, they'll shoot us dead from the dock." Hertha looked over at Floppy, who was sitting low, huddled next to Agatha at the back of the boat, neither of them saying a word. Vincent watched on and knew his part to play in this adventure. "The Mary Rose can grant you passage," he said as he stood up and peeked over the flat of the dock. "You must follow the winds on land." With that, he jumped up onto the floor of the dock and charged at the enemy. "Come on," said Hertha, ushering the group onto their feet to climb the ladder. "Little sea captain," said Willie to Hertha, who turned to face him while she nimbly ran up the ladder. He stood up on his little fishing boat, which rocked in the water, and pointed above the dockside. "The wind is north this noon," he said. Hertha nodded her appreciation as she helped the others up. They quickly moved behind a pile of huge fishing buckets, ropes and netting on the dockside. "Bye-bye, Mr. Willie," said Floppy, waving as he watched him row out into the harbour. Berry grabbed Floppy and pulled him lower to hide as his long ears protruded from behind the pile of buckets. "Where are we heading, H?" asked Berry as they watched the Mary Rose resistance fight the enemy around them. "You heard him," she replied. "The wind is blowing north." She pointed up at the tall roofs of the buildings that surrounded the dock. Berry was puzzled, licked one of his paws and held it up against the wind. "It's not you, you know. It's blowing west as far as I can tell." Hertha did not reply, but instead placed a paw around his shoulder and pointed up at a weather vane standing proud on top of one of the buildings. It too had a bronze ship as its signature and was pointing north. They chose their moment carefully and hid behind other buckets, the corners of buildings and seedy alleyways as they made their way north. "They're broken, I tells ya," observed Berry.